Welcome to the Center for Spiritual Deepening. Welcome to January, which feels just new and good at the Center for Spiritual Deepening. We say that September's a new year, but January is a new year. And I just told everybody who was here a few minutes ago, I'm very excited now because I will not make you sing happy birthday, but I just realized that it is January and that the center started mid-year in January of 2016. So we are 5 years old today. So I think that's kind of cool. And so, welcome to our birthday celebration with LJ Milone. I'm going to tell you a little bit about LJ and what's in store for us tonight, but also just to look ahead a little bit. So we're in January. We get to spend 3 weeks with LJ talking about Francis of Assisi. And just a technical note, the invitation that you have has a link that will work for all 3 weeks. But I will also endeavor to send it out again just because those things get lost in the weeds. So I'll try to think on Mondays to send it out again so that you just have it close at hand. But it will be the same link that gets you in. Then in March, we have a cool thing happening. Our interim rector, Rosemary Beals, is very experienced and gifted and sort of in love with the godly play that is the way that the Episcopal Church does Christian education, Christian formation with young children. And what godly play does is to explore the Bible, God, our relationship with God through the stories of the tradition. And so Rosemary, who loves this way of approaching things so much, is going to bring sort of the for grown-ups version of looking at our faith through stories and what they mean for our lives. So she will be with us on March 15th to do kind of, I don't know if she thinks it's funny that I think of it as godly play for grown-ups, but that's kind of what that will be. So exploring stories with Rosemary in March. And then Dana Green is here. We're looking at dates to make sure we've got it just right. But Dana Green, who's with us tonight, is an expert and a scholar on Evelyn Underhill, another wonderful mystic. And so Dana has agreed to come and talk to us about Evelyn Underhill in April. So watch for that as well. I think those are the things that I know. You all know about the other sort of ongoing things. Yeah, I think that's that. And so, I'm going to introduce LJ, but first I'm going to do the technical stuff. So Russ is recording, just know that, because he'll make it so that it's on speaker view and we're focused on LJ, but it's nice for us to be able to post classes on the website for people who weren't able to be here, so we'll do that. The other thing, you're familiar with this, we'll put everybody on mute just to avoid background noise. And the format will be LJ has a presentation and we'll just let him do that piece. He'll send us off into breakout rooms. We'll do that piece. So if you have questions, make a note of them, keep track of them. And in that last section at the end of the evening, LJ will take questions then. So hold that thought and we'll tell you how to offer your questions when we get to that point in the evening. So I'm going to pull up my notes so I don't do crazy things when I try to do a good job of introducing LJ for you. So LJ is with us for a number of reasons. He is the Director of Faith Formation at St. John the Baptist in Silver Spring and just is very involved in contemplative ministry, pastoral ministry in the Catholic Church in his own parish. He is a student of the mystics and a scholar on the mystics and a writer about the mystics. So we keep finding out great things when he joins us, so we keep inviting him back. And I think to me, the thing that's especially cool about having LJ with us and what I appreciate the most is that he combines that scholarly interest and interest in the life and the history and the stories of these people that we look into. But then he says, what does that have to do with me? What does that have to do with today? What does it have to do with my life? How do I kind of integrate this into my being? So LJ, that's what I look forward to and what I'm grateful for in you. And so.
Oh, thank you. All right. Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up? Yes? Yes? Good. I can't promise absolute silence on my end, even when I'm speaking. I have a house full of 4 young children and their bedtime ritual is thrown off. So I'll do my best, but sometimes you might hear a little squeal or, God forbid, a cry. But tonight I'd like to begin with one of Francis's prayers, a prayer written by the man, Francis of Assisi. So I invite you to close your eyes and take a big deep breath. All powerful, most holy, most high, supreme God, all good, supreme good, totally good, you who alone are good. May we give you all praise, all glory, all thanks, all honor, all blessing, and all good. So be it, so be it. Amen. So you might notice right away before I start doing a screen share here, Francis really likes goodness. Keep that in mind as tonight we're going to hear about his life. And he's got quite a life. It's a drama. Keep in mind his fascination with the goodness of God as you hear about his life. So let's begin. Okay. So I've titled this, Never Cease Adoring. And you can think of the life of Francis of Assisi as a gospel parable. A parable set in a medieval world of 12th century and 11th and 13th century Italy. I've called it Never Cease Adoring because of this line that Francis wrote as a commentary on the Beatitude, blessed are the pure of heart, they will see God. So Francis writes, the truly clean of heart are those who look down upon earthly things, seek those of heaven, and with a clean heart and spirit, never cease adoring and seeing the Lord God living and true. The secret, if you will, of how Francis of Assisi lived the gospel is contained in this one sentence. He always kept his heart, his mind open to the mystery of God. And there he is. There's a lot of artistic renderings of Francis of Assisi. And in fact, in the Library of Congress, I believe this is still true, he has the most books written about him, more than even Jesus himself. The most books written about any person in the world, I believe. I think I have to check myself on that, but at one time at least, he held that record. But there he is. So let me give you a very kind of quick snapshot. And by the way, I'm happy to share these slides with you. I'm going to be making more slides for next week and the week after. I'm happy to share them all with you. But Francis lived from 1182 to 1226. So 1182, he's born in Assisi. And here are just an overview. I'm not going to read every single one of these. But his life begins in Assisi, and he's taken prisoner when he's about 20. He suffers an illness. His conversion begins. We'll talk about San Damiano and getting naked before the bishop. We'll talk about what that means. He starts serving lepers. Companions join him. He starts building churches. And some big dates that we're definitely going to come back to as we talk these next few weeks. Look at 1219. In 1219, Francis goes to Egypt, and there he has an audience with the Sultan. That's a big one. And then in 1224, it says there, Francis receives the stigmata. And we'll talk about that too. And then in 1226 is the year of his death. He's very ill, and on October 3rd, Francis dies, enters into eternal life. Now, the church, at least the Catholic Church, celebrates the feast of St. Francis on October 4th, the day after he dies. Okay, so let's start. Let's start by talking about Assisi in the 12th and 13th centuries. That is in the late 1100s and the early 1200s. This is a modern picture of Assisi, and you might be able to see there's a big building on the left that kind of dominates the landscape. That was not there when Francis was alive, because that is the Basilica of St. Francis. We'll be talking a little bit about that and maybe about how that interacts with the vision of Francis. But if you can, imagine this hill with this small walled city sitting on top of it. Now, I've been there actually 3 times. And even though this may not look like a big hill, it's a climb. Let me tell you, it is a climb. It was set on a hill, like most city-states in medieval Italy, for defense. This was a time of great violence and great war. You might think, well, this was Christendom, wasn't it? This was the time when the church was kind of in charge of Europe. It didn't matter. In fact, one of the biggest conflicts of the time was between the Holy Roman Emperor, who was centered in kind of what we would today call Germany, and the Pope, and who had the power. And sometimes, as you travel down the boot of Italy, there'd be different cities who had different allegiances. So across the way from Assisi, a few miles away, is a town called Perugia. Both of them still in existence. Obviously, Assisi, you can see it there, but Perugia is also in existence still too. They had a fierce rivalry, and they had a war early on in Francis's life, in which he fought, and he was actually captured. But Assisi is interesting because it wasn't just about violence; it was kind of a pleasure spot. It was not a place where they were puritanical in any way. You might imagine it as kind of a Las Vegas on steroids, just wild parties. And who was at the head of those wild parties? None other than Francesco Bernardone, St. Francis of Assisi himself. Every year they had this festival that was called the Revels, and it was just a debaucherous, long-winded party. And every year they would nominate a king of revels, and sometimes they make a child into the bishop, and they do all sorts of things, and they pretty much trash the city. But for a few years in a row, Francis himself was named the king of the revels. So he was someone who liked to party, someone who liked to have fun, and he was kind of a leader in that regard. But tucked in that, the Subasio, it was a new phenomenon. It was a commune. It wasn't just a city, it was a commune. It's one of the oldest villages in Italy, and it's been Christian pretty much since the 2nd century. So here's what I was talking about earlier, the second point. Assisi was referred to as a new Babylon. Murder, street fights to the death were common. Revenge was considered a right. Vendetta, sacred duty. But here's what we got to keep in mind. A citizen in Assisi was put into 3 different groups. Very ordered and classified, stratified society. The maiores, those of greater standing, those were essentially the nobles, the nobility, the princes, the princesses, or the relatives of, the royalty. There were the mediani, or those of middling importance, and they really were non-existent for the most part. But in that class was Francis and his own family and his father, but they were quickly becoming maiores because they were from the middle class, the emerging middle class. Money was taking on a bigger importance in this time, and money was giving people power who weren't of noble birth. So that class of people was quickly going into the maiore class. But then the biggest class was the minores, those of lesser importance, minor, lesser. And this included all the peasants, all the people, all the general population who had no access to power or wealth, but maybe at least had a subsistence style of living. And as the note says there, those divisions had been in place for almost 200 years. Francis had some very early ambitions when he was a kid, when he was a young man. This is a statue in Assisi of Francis as a knight. He really very much wanted to be a knight when he was younger. He was very much shaped by the tales of Roland and King Arthur. So like any good medieval boy, he wanted honor, glory, romance. And at one point, as I mentioned already, Francis goes to war. He goes to war with Perugia. There he is right in the middle there on his horse. He certainly had the money to pay for all of the weapons and accoutrement and armor for being a knight. But, excuse me. But he was a very early casualty of the war with Perugia, and he languished in a prison, a damp, polluted prison for about a year. And while he was there, he caught malaria. And he was kind of bedridden for a year afterwards when he was finally able to go home. So for about a year, 2 years, he was not only in prison, but he was ill, he was deathly ill, and he was bedridden for a long time. And then he decided after that sickness, that convalescence, in 1205, he would accompany Walter of Brienne, a great Norman captain and the head of the papal forces. He would join him for a war in Apulia. But in the spring of 1205, so not very long into the year, Francis goes back to Assisi. And he was weakened again by a recurrent malaria and its effects. He was humiliated that he tried another venture and it didn't work. He was depressed and forlorn, and he'd again rely on his parents' care. But then he goes out. He's kind of wandering the hillsides. He's very forlorn and depressed. He doesn't know what to do with his life. He's like 21, 22 around this time. And he wanders into a small, dilapidated church called San Damiano. And this church is on the hillside. It's not in the walled city. So it's outside the city commune limit, but it's basically still kind of a part of Assisi, more or less. As it said, there was about a mile from the city walls. It was a small church. And in 1205, he wanders in and he sees this crucifix. Now, this is a picture of the actual crucifix that was in San Damiano in 1205. And Francis hears Jesus speak to him, this image of Jesus crucified. And in a kind and tender voice, the crucified Jesus says, "Francis, don't you see that my house is being destroyed? Go then and rebuild it for me." One of the, maybe you could say, part of the charisma of Francis is that he was eager and he was very concrete-minded. And so when he heard that message from the cross, he thought, naturally, I'm in a ruined church. I'm going to literally rebuild this church of San Damiano. Now, that message, of course, is a larger, grander message of rebuilding the church as the people of God. But of course, at this point, Francis is just focused on the immediate and the concrete. But still, he had been touched by, and this is going to be really important for us as we move forward, and important too for how you integrate his vision of spiritual life, of the spiritual life, into your own existence. He was touched by the concrete image of the humble, the poor, the rejected, the outcast Jesus. That all four of those words, poor, humble, rejected, outcast, they go into what he understands the crucified to be. So in addition to the San Damiano encounter, Francis had an encounter with lepers. Now, you have to know, lepers had rotting limbs, oozing sores, and really they weren't just people with what we know of as like Hansen's disease today. They had all manner of disfiguring skin conditions and contractable diseases. And lepers were forced to live on the outside of town in their own villages, and they could only enter into the actual village or the actual city for food or for any sort of alms by sounding a clapper or a bell. And for most people, that just sent them fleeing. So few people would ever come close enough to even toss a scrap of food to a leper. But in 1206, Francis was traveling to Assisi, back to Assisi. He was still kind of working with his father. His father, Pietro, owned a cloth shop, cloth merchant. He was a cloth merchant. So Francis was still kind of minimally engaged in the family business. But in 1206, he's traveling back to Assisi, and he crosses paths with some lepers. But he didn't flee in horror as he had so many times before. Instead, he approached one of the lame, and he didn't have any money. He didn't have any food to share, because at this point, he was starting to beg too. But Francis gave what he could. He knelt down and he gave an embrace. At this point, he starts to take a turn in his life towards the lepers. He starts to take care of them, a task few would do. And this involved feeding them, carrying them to a stream to wash their sores, begging for food for them. As it says here, for God's sake, there are so many lives of Francis, even within the first few decades of his death. I believe this is from Thomas of Celano's first life, the earliest life of Francis. And Celano says, for God's sake, he served all of them with great love. He washed all the filth from them and even cleaned out the pus of their sores. Now, this is a very reliable historical fact because the last paragraph on this slide are Francis's own words. At the end of his life, he composed what is called his testament, which is a really fascinating document. It gives us a very keen understanding of how he viewed his own life at the end of his life as he was dying. And this is how he begins his testament. The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, thus to begin doing penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. But then the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. So his conversion isn't a snap of the fingers, automatic. He has this experience of the crucifix of San Damiano, and he totally revamps his life. His conversion comes in stages, and it takes a while to work its way into his heart. Because this is in 1206. And if we just go back, San Damiano was in 1205. And this is a picture of Francis embracing the leper. Now, this was a huge deal. The lepers were very much in that minor class. In fact, they were the minors of the minors. They were the outcasts of the outcasts. So for Francis to go to them, to embrace them, for that to be an experience of sweetness is highly significant. And then we have this beautiful scene, this flagrantly Italian scene, you might even say. The title here is Nudus Nudum Christum Sequi. And in Latin, that's Latin, and it means naked, I follow the naked Christ. Francis had started to rebuild San Damiano, and he didn't really have any, wherewithal to do it. He needed some money to get some tools. And so he just took his father's money and bought some tools. Well, Pietro was not pleased about that and brought him before the bishop. And before the bishop, Francis strips naked, and he says this, until now I have called Pietro Bernardone, my father, but because I have proposed to serve God, I returned to him the money on account of which he was so upset, and also all the clothing which is his, and I want only to say from now on, our Father who art in heaven, and not my father, Peter Bernardone. Francis starts to understand that a life lived without possessions, a life fully identifying with the outcast, leads one to God. And here I want to take a pause from the slideshow, because there's so much drama in the scene. I want you to see it performed. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a second, and I'm going to share something else here, a YouTube video. This is from a movie called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. And right in the middle there is Francis. He's at the beginning of his conversion. I'm going to just back it up a little bit. Now, I've turned on closed captioning just in case you can't make it out what they're saying. But we're going to watch this for a few minutes just to see the drama of this scene.
Pietro di Bernardone, this will not do. How dare you disturb us when we are in the middle of saying our office? What's the matter with you, man? Have you lost your senses?
It's not my fault, Your Grace. It's him, that lunatic there.
Yes. It's me. My soul is in your hands. What? Are you trying to cause trouble? Is that what you're trying to do? Is this some damn plot to rob the church of its authority?
That's nothing to what he's done to me, Your Grace. I mean, God only knows I've always given him the best. I brought him up. I clothed him. I mean, you ask anyone, they'll tell you. He's never wanted for anything since the day he was born. But today, he threw all my belongings out of the window. And he even opened my strong boxes. Thrown to a mob of cutthroats like himself down in the street. Years of hard work and self-sacrifice just dust away.
Then what is the answer to these accusations? Surely you are sufficiently intelligent to understand that Holy Mother Church must punish those who subvert the established order. A man such as you is a menace to society. He's either criminal or
someone seeking the light. Someone in darkness. I was in darkness. But Brother Sun illuminated my soul. And now, I can see so clearly. Just as you did the day you chose the sacred vestments you are wearing now.
Are you seeking holy orders?
Me? No. I'm not worthy.
Then what do you want?
I want to be happy. I want to live like the birds in the sky. I want to experience the freedom and the purity that they experience. The rest is of no use to me. No use, believe me. If the purpose of life is this loveless toil we fill our days with, then it's not for me. There must be something better. There has to be. Man is a spirit. He has a soul. And that is what I want to recapture. My soul. I want to live. I want to live in the fields, stride over hills, climb trees, swim rivers. I want to feel the firm grasp of the earth beneath my feet, without shoes, without possessions, without those shadows we call our servants. I want to be a beggar. Yes, a beggar. Christ was a beggar, and his holy apostles were beggars. I want to be as free as they are.
Your Grace, even beggars show respect for their fathers.
I'm not your son anymore. What is born of the flesh is flesh. What is born of the spirit is spirit. I now am born again. Father, I give you back everything that belongs to you. Your clothes, your possessions. Your name, too. There are no more fathers. are no more sons. And everyone has left houses, or brothers, or sisters, or fathers, or mothers, or children, or fields, for the sake of our Heavenly Father, will receive 100 times more in the life to come.
All right. There you get a little bit of the drama of Francis's conversion. Let's go back to our slides. So you can see there the last point, he was throwing in his lot with all those who had nothing, with all the poor. You could see in that scene, one of the reasons I like that scene from Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. That's the name of the movie. I don't know if I mentioned that. I like that scene because it also shows the faces of the ordinary class of minores, of the peasants and the poor. So Francis was saying, I'm becoming one of you now. And to have nothing meant you literally have nothing. He's taking his place with the disenfranchised, and especially with the Christ he had encountered on the crucifix at San Damiano's church. At this point, Francis starts to spend a lot of time in prayer. There's this, I'll give you another view of it, but there's this on the right there, it's a statue in Assisi of Francis just in a cross-legged position, sitting on the ground, praying. And he would do this. Above Assisi, there are a bunch of caves, and Francis would go into these caves for lengthy periods of time just for prayer. In a lot of ways, Francis was actually more of a hermit than anything. He lived, at least most of his life, he lived in solitude and in prayer. And then he'd go out, and we'll see later on, he'd go out and be with the people. But he still spent a lot of time in contemplative silence and solitude. So especially now, after he renounces his family's name and wealth, he goes off and he actually gets a hermit's tunic from the bishop. That was Bishop Guido of Assisi, that imperious man. And he goes off, he starts rebuilding churches, taking care of lepers, and praying in caves at night. And that was his way. Without home or possessions, he worked at San Damiano, rebuilding it. He would retire to a shed or to a cave, and his prayer would intensify. In his testament, he says, I left the world. And as you saw from that dramatic scene, he cut ties with the business and the busyness, and we'd say the values of his own society. So his was a simple, joyous life of building, begging, nursing, praying. And from moment to moment, and this is the essence, I think, of what we're going to see poverty is all about. Francis was known for poverty, the virtue of poverty. From moment to moment, he was dependent on the mercy of God. And eventually, he's going to Mass. He's intensifying his life in the sacraments and prayer. And one day he's at Mass, and he hears the gospel, and it strikes him. The gospel says, as you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of God has come near. Take nothing for your journey. Take no gold, silver, copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, nor two tunics, nor sandals, nor staff. In other words, take nothing for the journey. And he replies, this is what I want. This is what I seek. This is what I desire with all my heart. And so he obeyed it literally. He removed his makeshift shoes. He set aside a staff he had as a hermit. He had a leather belt that he took off, and he just put on a piece of rope and discarded his other tunic. So he took this literally. So when he would finish a day's work or a portion of a repair at San Damiano, he'd wander about the plain. He'd wander over the valley. He'd enjoy the gurgles and the yellings of little children. And he'd urge people to turn their hearts to God.
So that gospel affected him. He said, oh, Jesus wants us to go share the kingdom. So he'd do his manual labor, he'd do his prayer, and then he'd go off into the valleys and the plains, urging people to come back to God and to show concern for the poor. This is a picture of a church called the Little Portion, Porziuncola, which is its official name is Saint Mary of the Angels. This church is still in existence, and it's very tiny. It looks like a chapel, doesn't it? Well, this is a church that Francis himself and the early brothers rebuilt, and it's still standing. Part of the reason it's still standing is that a church was built over it, so sheltering it from the elements. And I don't know if you recall, but I think this was sometime in the 90s. Pope John Paul II invited all the leaders of all the world's religions to come together for prayer and meditation. They came together in this exact spot. There's this beautiful image. I encourage you to Google it of all the world leaders, world religious leaders. On the one side, there's all these Christian leaders, including the Bishop of Canterbury and the Patriarch of Constantinople. And on the other side, there's the Dalai Lama, right next to the Pope, the Dalai Lama, all these yogis and Sufis, and a wonderful group of people that the Pope gathered in Assisi. And you'll see why as we go through our story. Francis had a heart for the outsider. Another little side note here: Saint Mary of the Angels, Santa Maria de los Angeles in Spanish, is the official name of the city of Los Angeles, because a lot of Franciscan missions were the kind of the established settlements out in the West, pretty much even through when America bought those or got those states. So at this point, Francis is basically a contemplative beggar. He is also a manual laborer, but he's going through the streets of Assisi, begging for food, begging for the lepers, and he's retiring at night to prayer. But slowly, and there was no plan to this, this was completely spontaneous, a group started to form around him. And, at this point, he's kind of an itinerant preacher, restorer of churches, a contemplative hermit. Well, Francis says this in his testament: after the Lord gave me some brothers, no one showed me what I had to do. But the Most High himself revealed to me that I should live according to the pattern of the Holy Gospel. And those who came gave whatever they had to the poor and were content with one tunic, patched inside and out, with a cord and short trousers. We desired nothing more, and we were simple and subject to all. By early 1209, then, Francis had 10 companions. Their names were Bernardo, Pietro, Giles, Silvestro. I'm saying them in Italian, but they're down there in English. Morico had been in another religious order. Philip had a natural gift for preaching. Juniper was known for his humor and for his patience. Leo was an ordained a priest and then joined Francis, and he became Francis's confessor, his secretary. Francis didn't really know how to read or write too well, so everything that we read from Francis's himself is actually dictated to Leo, his good friend and confessor. There was also Maceo, who was pleasant and had common sense, and Rufino, who was a very shy man. As you can see, they just saw him doing life differently, and they were attracted to that. Francis started a gentle revolution. He never had any intention to become a saint, to become something great. He never had any intention to found a religious order. He just wanted his brothers. He certainly never wanted them to be called the Franciscans. He wanted his brothers to be called the lesser brothers. So recall that ordering of society, that stratification: mayores, mediani, and the minores. Francis wanted his brothers to be minor brothers, lesser lowly brothers. This is from his rule, the second point. It says, whoever comes to them, meaning the brothers, friend or foe, thief or robber, let him be received with kindness. This is huge because he makes no distinction between high birth, low birth, criminal, holy person. Anybody was welcome to join his group. And he starts to take on a series of values, much more gospel inspired. So much so that at one point, the Holy Roman Emperor comes through Assisi, he's traveling through Assisi, and they tell Francis, and Francis doesn't care. His attention wasn't there. There's something so instructive about that. He didn't go and greet the emperor. He didn't go out and protest the emperor. He just ignored the emperor. We'll come back to that. But I think that's very instructive. He didn't ignore him out of protest or out of any negative attitude. His attention was just turned toward something better. But lest you think he's a really strict person, let's listen to this story real quick. One night, as the early brothers, they're numbering in a few dozen at this point. One night, a brother awoke and began to cry, and Francis ran to his side. And this friar said, "I'm dying of hunger." And the man was pale, his mouth was dry, he was close to collapsing. So Francis got some of their stored food and woke everyone up and said, "It's time to eat." And from then on, he tempered all the fasts, a very severe fast he'd been imposing on both himself and his brothers. But still, even though they'd go out and preach, even though they would bring this message of goodness and sharing with the poor and the way of poverty and throwing away your possessions, it seems that Francis, like Jesus, had real difficulty getting people to listen. And he actually had very little practical success, at least in terms of dramatic changes. The message he was preaching was just too astonishing. Right before the scene I showed you from Brother, Sun, Sister Moon, Francis is in his house and he's on the second story and he's just tossing clothes out the window. And he's yelling out the window, "Throw it all away, throw it all away. It won't bring you happiness." His father comes into the house in a rage, beats Francis, and as he's being beaten, Francis is smiling. We're going to talk more about this, but Francis found joy in often the most negative experiences. Even as he was being beaten, he was smiling. If that's happening, and remember, this is one of the things I think we don't talk about enough as Christians, that Jesus said, "Blessed are you when you're persecuted." I mean, I don't know that we in the church really know what to do with that. Well, it seems like Francis got that. He got what that meant. Blessed are those who are persecuted, who are insulted, who are reviled. As the early brothers lived their lives of poverty and manual labor and prayer, they were utterly reviled by the city of Assisi. They were thought to be lunatics, madmen, and often were mistaken for thieves or heretics, or they had all sorts of things thrown at them. Children would throw piles of mud at them. People would grab their hoods and drag them through the streets, and they were insulted and persecuted. And we're going to unpack what this means, especially next week. Francis tells his brothers to rejoice when that happens. Rejoice. What does that mean? My God, the level of freedom that he had. So, as we continue, Francis has a bunch of brothers now, and he decides that, you know what, and he actually gets advice from the bishop of Assisi, Bishop Guido, you should definitely go see the Pope and get approval, because this is becoming something bigger. So he goes with his early brothers to Rome, and he meets Innocent III, pictured here. This, by the way, is a fresco painted by an Italian painter named Giotto. And these frescoes are in the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. Giotto, I think, was active just a few decades after Francis. But he painted this image of Francis seeking approval for his community, his fraternity, from Pope Innocent III. There couldn't have been a stronger contrast between these two men. Innocent III, without sounding too pompous, you might think he was probably the most powerful pope in history. He was certainly an astute political worker. You know, he was able to maneuver and play the game of politics really well. He was a lawyer, canon lawyer, and he pretty much, stood toe to toe with the emperor and any other monarch in Europe, and they all bowed to him. So he was definitely a person into power. The way of Francis is the way of powerlessness. He submits himself to every authority. And this is what saved his group, because there were groups before Francis who started to live similar lifestyles, but they bucked the authority of the institutional church. Francis instead bowed to that authority. His advice to his followers was be subject to everyone, not just to the Pope or the bishop, but be the servants, the humble servants of everyone, and listen to everyone. That's a tall order. But he listens to the Pope listens to Francis and what Francis wants his community to do. And they get approval to basically preach in any town or locality, but they don't get the opportunity to preach at church necessarily unless they are already priests. But they were already running into issues because they'd go into certain towns, the bishop wouldn't like them, or I preached for them on Sunday. One story has it, Francis went to the bishop of a certain city and said, I'd like to say something to the people, and the bishop said, I preach to them on Sunday, and that's enough. So he was running into obstacles. So this was also a practical matter to get approval so that his reach could be wider. And this is one of the most probably well-known pieces of Francis. You might know about bird baths. Francis is often a saint. A statue of him is on a bird bath. It's because of this story. He preached to the birds. He got so fed up with a certain town in Italy, they weren't listening to him, that he went off and he kind of said half jokingly, I bet the birds would be a better audience. And then he says, that's exactly what I do. He was someone who was a flamboyant and kind of impetuous person. So he went off and found a group of birds. And the story has it, there was a great multitude of different types, doves, crows, monoclay, jackdaws, or magpies. And when Francis saw them, he ran swiftly toward them, leaving his companions. He was a man of great fervor, feeling much sweetness and tenderness, even toward lesser irrational creatures. When he was already very close, seeing they awaited him, he greeted them in his usual way, the Lord give you peace, and he preached to the birds, and they all listened. I don't want to read you the whole story. We're running out of time. But what's interesting about this story is that if you look at other literature of the time, the types of birds mentioned in this story are symbols for the poor, and they're symbols of freedom. So there might be more to this story than just a cute story of Francis talking to birds. It might be that the only people willing to listen were the poor, and that there's a freedom and a joy in poverty. As Francis doing his preaching, he would often seek out, even at all times of his life, places of rest and solitude. He would take 40 days at a time, often on islands in the middle of lakes or on mountaintops, and spend them in complete solitude. And he did this really until his death. I'm going to skip this story. We'll talk about that another time. But I do want to highlight this. We're going to come back to this story probably in our third session. In 1219, Francis goes to Damietta, Egypt. And he goes with the Fifth Crusade. So if you don't know, the Crusades are these big holy wars between Christianity and Islam at the time. And this was the Fifth Crusade, the fifth venture of a European army into Muslim lands to retake the Holy Land. Well, Francis goes with them because he desired to preach, to convert the Muslims, and he desired martyrdom. He thought that was the crown. If I can die for the faith, that'll be, the crowning achievement of my religious life. He doesn't do either one, but he does once he sees a battle unfold and he sees how horrible it is. He says to himself, there has to be a better way. I have to go seek peace. I have to go talk to the Sultan. And so he goes across the battlefield. He comes right to the Muslim camp and he asks to speak to the Sultan. Well, the Muslim army recognizes him as looking kind of like their own mystics, their Sufis. And so they bring him right to the Sultan. And he does what no crusader at that time could. He talks to the Sultan, who was a remarkably open-minded person, and refuses to execute Francis because Francis was trying to convert him, and instead honors Francis, and they kind of come to a friendly understanding. This is a great example of Francis being a man of peace and reaching out to the other, even when the other is someone that European society has vilified for literally centuries, meaning Muslims. I mean, centuries even at this point, they were being vilified. Francis violates those norms and sees a Muslim as a brother. He gets back to Italy, and no sooner does he land in Italy than he just starts experiencing a bunch of friar troubles. So from this period, about the 1219, 1218, until the end of his life in 1226, the friars, there's basically two camps. One group of friars wants to lead a more sturdy, less arduous, kind of traditional life as a religious. And so they want hierarchy, they want, buildings. As soon as he gets back to Italy, some friars built a large stone building near St. Mary's. Celano says he was really annoyed and he starts to tear it down himself. He finds that a lot of the friars don't want to live the poverty he's talking about. And Francis says to them, my brothers, God has called me by the way of simplicity and humility. I don't want you to mention to me any rule. They wanted from Francis a rule to live their lives. They thought, a rule like St. Augustine's or St. Bernard's rule or St. Benedict's rule. And Francis says, don't mention to me any of those. The Lord showed me what to do. He wanted me to be a new kind of fool in this world. Still more friar troubles. His insistence on radical poverty. I'm not going to read all this. I just want to summarize real quick. And the lay character of his group really was at odds with the society of his time, with Christendom. The official church and the culture did not like this. It was really irritating, in fact, to them because his way of life contradicted a lot of medieval values. But for a lot of these newer friars, Francis, to them, seemed too idealistic, too impractical, and often they ignored him and even abused him. Often when the friars, because he was in poor health at this point, he contracted an eye disease while he was in Egypt. That affected him the rest of his life. He started losing all his sight, and he was in a great deal of pain. Well, often when he was back at St. Mary of the Angels, and a friar didn't care for Francis's vision and would not just ignore him, but maybe even abuse him or insult him or forget to get him some food or some medicine, Francis would only do this. He would go immediately to prayer. He did not want to complain about that brother. He did not seek any sort of revenge. He did not seek any sort of restitution of his rights. His whole point was, I have to be an example of charity and forgiveness. And just to show you how far they violated Francis's wishes, this is the Basilica of St. Francis, built by one of his early followers, Brother Elias. Francis probably almost literally turned over in his grave that such a huge stone building was built in his honor. When he told them, don't live in stone houses, don't become possessors of any land or any property. So Francis had to let go. He was unwilling to impose his will on anybody. He actually told the brothers, I resign from leadership. From now on, I am dead to you. And he says, the greatest help I can give is to spend time in prayer for my brothers every day. So he descends into darkness. He gives the brothers a rule, but he's trying to come to terms with the fact that he has failed so often. He didn't convert the Muslims. He didn't become a martyr. He can't control his brothers. And he prays, who are you, my dearest God, and what am I but your useless servant? And he just keeps going deeper and deeper into abandonment and to surrender. So from basically 1223 to 1224, he's in this immense spiritual darkness. His health worsens, and he keeps going to hermitages. And one of them is Greccio. And in Greccio and Hermitage in 1223, he creates the first recorded manger scene. And he preaches about God's humility and the poverty of Jesus. Then he goes to another hermitage on Mount Laverna. He agreed to go to the coolness there with 4 of his most faithful disciples, Leo, Angelo, Rufino, Maceo. And there he has a vision of a seraph, an angel crucified. And this religious experience is so profound and so deep and so moving that he realizes from now on, he is identifying with Christ crucified. He's now come to realize what following Jesus in poverty really means. It means accepting our own limitations and utterly relying on God and God alone. And that life is not about visible signs of material or spiritual success at all, but following Jesus along the path of the cross in decline, frustration, failure, weakness, and even death. He comes down from Laverna radiantly happy. And there he is at Laverna. On Saturday morning, October 3rd, 1226, Francis tells his brothers to put him on the ground naked and let him lie there for as long as it takes to walk a mile. And he does this as he realizes he's going to die. In the core of his being, Francis, naked on the ground, was utterly dependent on God alone. His companions, his close friends, Bernard and Giles, took his hands, and Francis whispers, I've done what is mine. May Christ teach you what is yours to do. So that's the life of Francis. And I wanted to give you a good 20 minutes. I apologize. That took longer than I thought it would. How about 15 minutes? And that way we have at least a few more minutes for questions. Here are some small group questions, and I know that Lisa will also supply them to you in the chat. So go off into some small groups and think about these questions. There we go.
Hi.
Okay, everyone.
We got kicked out.
Okay.
So LJ, do you want to give people sort of options for how they want to say what they want to say?
Sure. If you
Chat
like,
or raising hands?
if you like to ask a question, you can just kind of go like this and I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. Or you can ask in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function and someone will get to you. But if you have a question, go ahead, raise your hand or go in the chat, whatever you'd like to do.
In our room 5, I said we are well aware here in our particular area of people who head up nonprofits who spend their lives feeding the poor. And they are working so hard now these days that, I mean, normally they work terribly hard. I don't know how they stand it. housing and health and food and all that, and now it's COVID. And Kathy Cycle, who was on earlier, was telling us that she spent all this past week trying to get people who attend a service at a Presbyterian church in our area called Agape, where every Friday night a group of challenged adults come together, 45, 50, for dinner, and they are a community. And some of us feed them one Friday night a month at the Presbyterian church. And they are trying to get them scheduled for COVID, and they don't have computers or cell phones. So it's kind of hard to get them registered.
Yeah, that community of adults and young adults and children who were, mentally or physically challenged in some way, they would clearly be a group Francis would go to.
For sure.
For sure. And in addition, think of any group that is on the outs today, any group that is downtrodden, any group that is marginalized. And Francis would say, we go there. In fact, in his rule, this is what was such a big problem for a lot of the early friars. He said, rejoice to live among the outcast. Well, they didn't want to live there. They wanted to live in comfortable houses. And you know what? Who can blame them to a degree?
Right.
No? Anyway, other comments, other questions? Yeah, Peg, go ahead.
Well, in our group, we just talked about in our area, there is a nunnery, the Sisters of Port Clare. And what is the value of just being a cloister community and praying, not taking action?
Yeah, Francis faced that very question in his life. There's so many stories, I couldn't get into them all, but one of the stories was he wanted some advice about whether to just retire and be a hermit the rest of his life or go and be among the people. And it was Saint Clare of Assisi, his dear friend, who said, no, the people need you. And so he listened to Clare and went off and preached and nursed lepers and preached and brought people through his joy, through his freedom, back to God. Yeah. But you notice when he received that abusive treatment from his own brothers towards the end of his life, when there was a certain faction of them that just couldn't deal with it wasn't just the material poverty, it was the powerlessness. It was the identification with those on the outside, with the marginal, that people couldn't deal with. Living without possessions, actually, that can be more or less easy. But identifying with the powerless, taking a path of powerlessness, that was harder than they could bear. But notice, when he got abusive treatment from his own brothers, he would immediately go to prayer. And he said, that's the best thing I can do for my brothers. And not seek to get back at them, but be an example of charity and of forgiveness. This is a whole new way of acting. Now, we should know this, right? Because we've heard the gospel presumably all our lives, but actually living it. G.K. Chesterton, I think he had that famous line that Christianity is a nice idea. Someone should try it sometime.
Yeah.
But actually, G.K. Chesterton says probably the only true Christian was Francis of Assisi.
The thing that I was in the same group as Virginia, and another thing that we talked about, that there's, it's one thing to give up everything material that you have, but the thing that struck me was how he told his father, "You're not my father anymore." And we were saying, if one of our kids ever said that to me, I'd be heartbroken. And I just feel like that's really tough. And I understand, Jesus has said, take up your cross, and nothing is more important than being, following God. And if it means forsaking your family, but that would be the hardest thing. I mean, can't I have it both ways? I mean, have my family and just, that just seems, it almost sees cruel. And I mean, I looked at that scene in the movie, the devastation on his father's face and the mother too. I mean, they were, they'd given everything, and it just, so it's fair. It's it's being Christian's a nice idea. Somebody ought to do it, but I don't know if I'm will. That's how far would I go? I think, how far would I go? And how much am I ready? How much am I ready to forsake for that single-minded purpose in life?
Right. And I don't, it's funny because Francis eventually founded a group for lay people who didn't want to leave their families.
Yeah.
They were called the Third Order. They're still in existence today. In fact, they're not just in Catholic churches, they're in Episcopal churches, Lutheran churches. So you can go and become a Franciscan and still be married and still have kids and all that.
Yeah.
But there was some mercy in what Francis did for his family, or did to his family, because you have to understand his cultural mindset was a lot more like the mindset and the culture of Jesus than our own. Family and community was everything, and you basically saw yourself reflected in other people's eyes in a value called honor. Mm-hmm. Now you could say, well, what Francis did was pretty shameless, and what he did is he dishonored his family, but cutting himself off actually saved them face over in the long run. He was off on his own, and now Pietro and his mother were no longer held accountable for Francis's actions. But still, that's crazy. There's no getting around that. There's no getting around.
That's a good way to look at it. I mean, he saved them the dishonor of having a son that was a nutcase instead of a lawyer or a doctor or whatever they wanted him to be.
And Pietro was so he was so into the values of that society. Power mattered, money mattered. It was almost inevitable that they were going to go in different directions.
Yeah.
He was a very different man with very different goals.
Yeah.
Pietro wanted to ascend. Just before Francis's birth, there was a rebellion in Assisi. All of these rich merchants rebelled against the noble class and threw them out of Assisi. So he was pretty much at the top. He only wanted more power. He only wanted more money. And that was his dream for Francis. Yeah. And Francis, right before that scene that I showed you in the movie, and Francis is, throwing out all the clothes and telling everybody on the streets, throw it all away. None of it's going to make you happy. He looks at his father dead in the face and says, "Father, I want to share my joy with you. None of this is going to make you happy. Throw it." And then he just throws a bunch of his possessions away. And you can see the ire rising on it, the redness getting into Pietro's face. But it certainly wasn't an act of defiance as much as, this is just, I'm called to go this way. Okay, I have to make a clean break. Here's the clean break.
But, and Pietro had called him out for using his money to renovate the church. And so that was what predicated him saying, okay, fine, and stripping off his clothes. And here you go. Here's everything you paid for.
You didn't have to bring him before the bishop. Yeah. Good point.
Makes sense.
Oh, Colleen, did you want to say something there?
Yeah. I think what struck me most was the difference in his previous life and after he was called or had his vision or whatever you want to call it. And God does that so often, takes the worst and makes the best. And once again, it shows. Here he was a partier, he was the king of the rebels, all that stuff. And yet in his heart, he changed. That really struck me once again.
Yeah, and that's probably what fascinated those very early companions, that they probably knew Francis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure everybody in that city knew Francis because he was up all hours of the night, carousing and drinking and generally being a nuisance. And to see him now on the plains below Assisi, rebuilding his old church, hanging out with lepers, I'm sure that's why his very first companion was Bernardo. I'm sure that's why Bernardo just thought, what happened to him?
I want to ask you about that little church, though. That fascinated me. The St. Mary's of the Angels. Was that part of the church where he had his calling or vision, or was that somewhere else?
That was a difference. So there's two different
Okay.
and churches. They were more like chapels in our view.
Yeah.
They were really tiny. The first one was San Damiano. San Damiano was much closer to Assisi, about a mile away. Again, that's where the crucifix spoke to him. And then a little further, a few more miles down the road, St. Mary of the Angels. And that's the picture I showed you of the little church inside the church. That kind of became Francis's home base and where he lived.
So when he went to the Pope to get approval for his order or whatever he was going to call it, were they preaching in those small churches before? I mean, was that illegal?
Yeah, that's probably one of the reasons why the bishop said, you better go get approval. And they probably got, I don't know if you see, images of friars, or maybe you've seen like Friar Tuck, they often have like a circle of hair and then a bald patch in the middle. That's called a tonsure. A tonsure was a sign that you were kind of under the protection of the church and you had kind of an authority or a permission to do something. So Francis probably got a tonsure once he met with the Pope. Said, okay, now you can go preach safely. But even preaching outside of church, like giving the sermon, just preaching in like the town square, you had to have permission to do that. But otherwise, it was pretty serious. You could be punished as a heretic and be thrown in jail or put to death. Other comments or questions? I see that's a little after 9, so I don't want to keep you if you have to go. I just have a prayer just to offer you before we go, but any final comments or questions?
Can you just give us an idea of what you've got planned for next week?
Oh, sure. Next week, we're going to talk about poverty. Poverty, it can bring a great deal of joy and freedom into our lives. You heard, this is not something Francis necessarily said, but in the video, you heard the actor who played Francis say, I want to be like the birds. I want to experience their freedom. I want to be happy. There's a happiness that comes from not possessing. We're going to unpack what that means next week, because that's really the key to understanding Francis, his vision for the spiritual life, and the change it can bring to our own lives today. Yes, please, Robbie, go ahead. Oh, you're muted. Robbie.
You're mute.
Is that movie available? Like, should we try and look at that in this
You
coming
can.
week?
You certainly can. It's called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. It is available on Amazon Prime. You can rent it if you want. It's a fun, beautiful movie. It was made in the early 70s. So it has a flavor of, it's like a little Woodstock flavor. But it's great. It actually is very good about giving you the spirit of Francis, and it gives you some of the early stories. Yeah, that'd be a great one. There's also a movie, I think it's called Francesco, with Mickey Rourke playing Francis. And there's even a very old movie called The Flowers of St. Francis. You can get the whole movie on YouTube, but that's black and white and in Italian. Subtitles, with good subtitles. I don't know if you noticed the subtitles.
They were hysterical.
Yeah, they sure were.
Yes, they were.
Well, yeah, if you want, I was thinking of maybe using another scene for next week, but feel free. It's a great movie.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
If there's nothing else, let's go back to the prayer we began with. Now, again, imagine Francis, for a good part of his life, because he was in that prison cell in his 20s, contracted malaria. He had this very painful eye disease. He had deteriorating health for at least half of his life, and he died when he was 44. And this is still the prayer that maybe most characterizes his life. I invite you to close your eyes and take a deep breath. All powerful, most holy, most high, supreme God, all good, supreme good, totally good. You alone are good. May we give you all praise, all glory, all thanks, all honor, all blessing, and all good. So be it. So be it. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone. Until next week, we'll see you then.